All right, so welcome back, and there'll be kind of change of gear from something heavily computational to something which is like essentially just storytelling. And the story of writing, I will essentially be just doing a kind of narration. Hopefully, it will be somewhat helpful, but if not, I hope at least it will be fun. So, by the way, just an organizational thing. So we'll be putting up most of the slides, as and when we get them, on the website. So we've already gotten 4 out of the 5 set of slides that we had yesterday. So at some point of time, Ashraf would be putting them up on the website. Okay, so you can just download them. And at some point, these videos, we are recording these, and so at some point of time, we'll also be, featuring them on YouTube, so you should be able to also see them. All right. So I take this title of my talk from a very nice book by Andrew Robinson, in which he basically, with lots of pictures, talks about how writing came about, and I recommend that book strongly to everyone. It's a fantastic book. I will not exactly be following that book. I mean, I will be taking my own tack. So Robinson's book is a good complement to what I'll be talking about. So if you recall, yesterday I showed you the slide that writing comes in a variety of forms, but broadly we can classify them into alphabetic, syllabic, ideographic, and logosyllabic. And they are primarily distinguished by how many signs, how many distinct signs you have in each of these systems. So there's a very interesting trade-off between how many signs do you have, how many distinct signs do you have in a particular writing system, and how long typically the words that you form in that system will be. And this is something that Ashraf would be talking about, that how typically if you take into account the fact that, for example, in an ideographic system like Chinese, which has more than 50,000 signs, each of these characters actually indicate something quite complex or could mean something quite complex. Typically the word size would be 1, 2, or maybe 3 characters long. Whereas, alphabetic system, the words could be, for example, typically 10 characters long. So there's a very nice trade-off between, if you have a very complex writing system which involves you remembering lots and lots of signs, typically the words that will form are quite short, right? And so, the brevity of what you write essentially compensates for the fact that you have to remember all these many different characters. But of course, the price you pay is that to learn this kinds of writing system, you have to spend a long time, figuring. For example, to achieve school efficiency in Chinese, of course, you can't hope to remember all of these more than 50,000 signs. So, essentially, let's say a subset of 5,000 signs is essential, and then, like a learned Chinese scholar would be expected to know something like 20,000 signs and so on. So this more than 50,000 signs that I'm talking about is what you obtain if you do a, tabulation of all the signs that have been used in any piece of Chinese writing over several centuries. No single individual probably knows all of these, greater than 50,000 signs. You can't even expect to. Sorry? Yeah, so nowadays, of course, they use sometimes Roman and so on. But they can also use the rebus principle, which I'll be talking about there, where they're using the particular Chinese character for its sound value alone, not for what it stands for. That's actually a very important point, which I will come to, this use of rebus principle. So this is something that Ashraf would be talking about. Ashraf, that's really your last talk, where you show how binary size and word length kind of compensate each other. All right. Okay. Quick question. Which do you think came first? Which of these writing systems? Or which is the earliest of these? Which of these is the earliest that people used? Sorry? Well, That's a dead giveaway, isn't it? Because most of you are historians. Yeah, I should probably not have had these examples. Right. Yes. So, incidentally, there's this very interesting hypothesis that originally Chinese was also logosyllabic. Okay. And what happened was effectively these combinations of logograms. So, by the way, does everyone know what a logogram is? No. Okay. All right. So, when you use a sign to represent a particular object, let's say you have a picture of an ox, and you essentially use it to mean the word ox, or you use a picture of a woman, or something indicative of a woman, and you use it to mean woman, and it has nothing to do with the sound value. All right. So then, essentially, it is be considered a logogram. So, if you see a woman and you use a modifier to indicate that it's actually a goddess. So, woman and goddess have, no sound value in common, but simply from the fact that you're using the logogram of a woman and you use a modifier to indicate that this is meant in a divine context. So that modifier essentially says that it's woman, but in the divine context, and so you read it as a goddess. Okay. So then essentially it becomes a modified logogram, and you are essentially expressing various thoughts in these ways. So Chinese originally arose as a very similar system where they would have certain signs representing complex concepts, and then they'd use certain modifiers to indicate that, whether when you use a picture like a woman, do you mean it as a woman? Do you mean it in sense of fertility? Do you mean it in the sense of a goddess? But at some point in its history, each of these logosyllabic combinations became a logogram in its own right. So basically, the fact that you could modify each logogram with a particular modifier, this adaptability was lost and it became rigidly frozen. So each of this logogram and syllabic combinations itself became an ideogram, and that's when we eventually ended up with the way the Chinese system is today, having order of 10,000 or more signs. So the historical sequence is that it's possibly the logosyllabic was how writing first arose, and then eventually we had the syllabic system, and in a separate tack, ideographic system arose as a result of freezing of a logosyllabic system. And much later, we had the invention of the alphabetic system. So I'll go into each of these in detail soon. Now, it's believed that writing originated independently multiple times over the human history, at least 4 times. So one of these is, of course, the invention of the cuneiform, which is a logosyllabic system. And Egyptian hieroglyphs is also usually considered to be an independent writing system, although there was clearly a lot of diffusion between the Egyptian civilization and the Sumerian and the Mesopotamians. So it's probably not very surprising if there was diffusion of ideas between these two civilizations, but broadly it is thought that these two writing systems arose independently. The third writing system which arose independently is that of the Chinese, which essentially would be dating from about the 2nd millennium BCE. And the fourth writing system which arose independently is the Proto-Mayan system in Central America. Now, there could be a fifth one, which is the Indus inscriptions, but of course there's a big debate as to whether it's even writing at all. So that's why we are not sure, and it's not very clear whether it was actually influenced by the contemporaneous writing systems of Sumeria and Susa. So we cannot say for certain that the Indus inscriptions were another example of writing being invented independently. Right? Now there's a very nice video on YouTube which shows the spread of writing I hope this works. Let's see. Okay. Let's see. I hope that doesn't. As usual, Murphy's. Oh no, fine. All right. So this is a video created by Oli Bai, and what it shows is how writing arose year by year. So since writing arose independently in Central America, this portion is shown separately. So you can see initially you have the Egyptian, the Mesopotamian, and the Indus script, which are basically contemporaneous scripts. And then you have the linear A, linear B occurring in Mycenae and Crete. Then the Chinese writing systems. And then, by the 800 BC, you see that writing has mostly spread, across the world. So you have it in Central America, you have it in the Mediterranean basin, you have over here in China. India is conspicuously absent, as you can see, until Brahmi arises, and at some point we will notice that it would be spreading all over the globe. So initially, nothing seems to be going on, and then. Yeah, so this is basically the Etruscan and all those kinds of languages. Okay. If you're interested in South Asia in particular, at some point you would see, so this is basically Kharoshthi and, all these scripts. So now we are approaching the, Alexandrian period. Yeah, so you finally have Brahmi developing, and eventually you will see, essentially it's spreading all across with the Tamil Brahmi, and subsequently followed by the Grantha script, the Devanagari, and so on. Okay, so it's a fun video to watch. It goes on right up to the present era, so I won't bore you further with it. So let's go on to much more interesting topics, which is this whole topic of how writing arose. So one of the big issues with trying to figure out how writing arose is to identify what exactly writing is. And is it writing in the sense that we mean it? So when we talk about writing, as we talked about in yesterday's tutorial, we typically mean, yeah, go on. Spread of writing, I mean, this is writing. So as I mentioned, writing is distinct from language.
Yeah, the spread of writing is correlated with the population density, right?
Yeah.
It has to be.
Yeah, because, well, actually more about the complexity of the civilization, because why do you need writing? Okay.
Yeah, that's my question. So is it, because initially when, I think it was Brahmi which was spreading across the, I don't know, the northern strip
of the
correct.
Country.
So does it have to do with the fact that it's a fertile land and people were more productive, or is it simply a consequence of population?
Well, more than population, I would say that, I guess, you can only have a high density of population if you have a sufficiently complex civilization, right? So, if you have kind of a large area which is under a centralized administration, then you suddenly have need for robust communication of various, data which needs to be sent across large distances, right? And if you want to make sure that it does not get mutated, you have to make sure that there's a system by which you encode it such that it can be carried over from one point to another by messengers without getting mutated on the way. Okay, so presumably that's why you require writing when you have a sufficiently large area under central administration.
Also, one more question. When people adopt different languages,
Yeah.
people who already have a language,
Mhm.
when they adopt a different writing style,
Mm.
that's significantly different to this situation that you're showing, right? Because here people are acquiring a new writing style. When it's not like they're replacing an old writing style with a new one.
No, it could be replacing an old writing system with a new one. Like, for example, during the Arab conquest of Persia, the original Persian writing system was replaced by the Arabic writing system. So you could have a replacement.
No, as in going back to the video, it was
Yes.
mainly the origin, like how people acquired the writing style rather than replacement, right? The video that you showed.
So the video doesn't show, like, for example, the period around 9th or 10th century when you had the Arab conquest of Persia. So there you would see that, the cuneiform or whatever was the corresponding Persian writing system of that time being essentially overrun by the Arabic system. Okay. So you have that also. But in the particular case that you're talking about, South Asia, there you don't have anything shown. Okay. And Brahmi is basically going through what effectively is shown here as virgin territory.
Also, there is an error that they shows the Indian writing systems are added BC, but actually it is 1500 BC we have Indus script.
No, Indus script is primarily dated from 2500 BCE to 1900 BCE. And no, but it is shown there. So if you notice in the video, let me just see if it runs again. Yeah. So if you notice, Indus actually comes in pretty early. So you can even see that they are actually encoding the population using gray. So yeah, you are right. I mean, there is to some extent a correlation within population, but I think it has got more to do with civilization and so on. See here, you got the Indus. So then that's like 2000 BCE. So that they have correctly given. Okay. So what is happening in the 500 BCE is basically the Brahmi script which is coming. Okay. Yeah.
So,
Was there a question? Yeah.
rock art is also a form of writing, just excluded from here, that's all.
No, because when we
Pictorially, you are messaging something.
No. But
yeah.
when we are talking about writing, it means that it has to have syntax. So this is one of the big debates about what whether Indus inscription corresponds to writing, right? The debate is it syntactic in nature? Is it expressing a syntactic system? Okay. So to have syntax, not only do you need to have the fact that there are numerous common components which are strung in a particular sequence, you also have to show that there is embeddedness, that there are subsequences which occur as a entity in some other sequences. Okay? So in some sense, they are there is a reason why they are being strung together. It's not just some arbitrary placement of symbols. So with cave art, we are never quite sure what they are. I think there was a question from Vani. Sorry. Yeah. So why writing has, I'm scared to talk about it because there are tons of historians present here who might cut me to pieces. But the idea is that you require a certain level of socio-political complexity before writing becomes viable, because there is a cost, right? You have to have specialists. Typically, primitive, the earliest writing systems are horrendously complex. To learn that writing system, you require years of training. And so Egyptians and Sumerians would send boys to scribal schools where they were taught just how to read, write this system. And they're highly specialists. So the society is not really a literate society in our sense. Most people are actually illiterate. There's only a very elite group who can actually read and write in that system. And that requires, a sufficient level of economic affluence to be able to afford, to have people who do nothing else other than just, read and write. Like us, yeah, exactly. Except that here, of course, literacy is far more widespread. So you can be doing something else, but you're still literate. And so that is actually one of the reasons why you see that there's a drive towards simpler and simpler writing systems, which you don't need, years of specialized training to, be able to acquire. Okay. Yeah.
So the date you are showing for this Tamil Brahmi inscription, which is like 200 BC, but the recent excavation.
I didn't show
Yeah,
it.
that video. Okay.
No. So I didn't show it.
Okay,
That's
okay.
not my
Okay,
video.
okay. Okay, so based on this recent excavations and AMS dating, so Tamil Brahmi, the date pushed back to 600 or 500 BC. So which could be possible that it emerged much before to the Ashokan Brahmi time period. So what's your...
No. I mean, look, I'm not a historian. Okay.
Okay.
So I will leave this question for historians to debate. This is just meant as a context in which we work. Yeah. So I know that there's this big debate as to when Brahmi. So by the way, I will show you one slide as to what is the current hypothesis about Brahmi itself. Okay. And then later on we can have a debate about this. Okay. Yeah. Can you just hold on to your question? I think all your questions will be answered today by Nandini. So Nandini will be having like 1.5 hours full of Brahmi. Okay? So after that, if you still have questions, again you can ask Nandini. All right. So yeah. So one of the big problems with early writing is that they don't exactly correspond to what we mean by writing today. Okay? So to expect, for example, so this is a seal from Mesopotamia, which is dating from, dated to about 3100 to 2900 BCE. And these are not really encoding any poem or a piece of literature, which is what we typically associate with writing. Rather, writing arose primarily for expressing administrative or for recording administrative instructions or tabulating data and so on. Okay. And sorry. So there's this wonderful book called First Writing in which Bruce Trigger and Cooper have written articles on what writing originally arose for. And one of the points they make is that first writing is actually not really for encoding language, the spoken language, but rather for things for which there is no oral counterpart. So for example, livestock, ration accounts, land management record, lexical text, which is basically word lists, then labels identifying funerary offerings. So if you see the first Egyptian writing, these are typically, in the tomb, you will have funerary offerings which are tagged and then certain marks are given over there. Then the Chinese Shang bone records, for example, are basically records of divination. So they would be heating these shells to very high temperature, and then as a result of this heating, there would be cracks forming, and then a shaman would be there who would be interpreting what do these cracks mean, what do they say about the future, and so on. And then this particular prediction would be recorded on these shells. Then commemorative stele, you are basically commemorating some famous person. So these are not really something we typically talk about, right? You don't talk about a ration account. Even now, there is very little grammar in accounting tables, right? There's not really much scope for grammar. So in some sense, writing was used, at least in the earliest stage, to record things for which spoken language does not work. So this is something we need to note when trying to decipher ancient inscriptions like Indus and so on. And there have been suggestions that the earliest writing, for example, don't even have syntax. So some of the suggestions are that the early writing could be meant for recording some kind of a transaction. So they could be accounting tokens, or they could be heraldic devices. So basically, you want to show that you're from this particular family. Okay? So in the medieval period, for example, when knights would go into battle, each of them would carry a shield or banners, which would have a particular set of symbols to indicate that they are this particular noble family. So this is, of course, not confined just to the medieval age. And so, yeah.
So when we talk about writing, does that include numericals as well, or does it predate everything we know about writing?
No, so numerical would be, for example, in accounting tokens.
Okay.
That's what you'd be using, right? You'd be basically recording how many oxen were, let's say, given to a particular temple.
So when we talk about whole numbers, like what are whole numbers, what we say, it's a bijection function. So a sheep implies one rock, two sheep, two rocks. So is that also a language or a writing script?
No, so, as I said, the question is whether you have syntactic features. And syntactic features includes this ability to embed
Counting.
Strings within other strings and so on, right? So these would not be considered full writing. Full writing would be something where you can express anything you want, right? Not just particular numerical things. Okay? So a system which is only capable of recording numbers would not be considered full writing system, right? And we'll see examples of this actually. So a subset of heraldic devices are things called tagmas, which nomadic tribes in Central Asia, for example, used to use to indicate the clan for which they come from. A third possibility is something that I just mentioned briefly yesterday. They are like the symbols that the Dabbawalahs use to indicate where a particular tiffin box is supposed to go. So, since many of them are illiterate, it's no use writing this down. So you need to have a set of symbols which is easily comprehensible. Fourth possibility is that there's some kind of ritual or religious symbols. A fifth possibility is that they are basically just used as an aid to memory. So you want to remember something, you use, something like a knot or something to, help you remember that this is what you're supposed to remember. The problem is, of course, that is not comprehensible to someone else. So, the knot that you give means something to you, but it may not mean anything to another person. All right, so let's see each of these possibilities in turn. So Schmidt-Besserat has actually come up with a fascinating hypothesis as to how Sumerian writing originally arose in the context of creating accounting tables. So her idea is that when the Sumerian temples would receive donations, they would create some kind of a tabulation of how many donations they're receiving of each type. And so for what they used to do is that they would create these tokens. The shape of these tokens represent, for example, how many, so for example, this could represent 10 animals. This would be a unit of grain measure. This would be a unit of land measure. This would indicate, so this is 10 animals, this represents 100 animals, and so on. So you see each of the shapes encode number as well as type of the offering. And so if you are, let's say, sending some amount of votive offerings from one place to another, what you will do is you will say communicate this to someone else by taking each of these tokens, putting them all together, and just for safety what you will do is you will put them inside a clay ball. So basically you want to seal it. Okay, so what you do is you take each of these elements which essentially represent what you're offering, you put them in a clay jar, then you seal it, and then you send it across. So the receiver then can break this seal, take out these tokens, and basically figure out what was sent and then tally it with whether it all has been received. Now at some point, some smart Sumerian accountant figured out, well, you know what, you don't really need to actually break it. So you can even mark on the top of this clay envelope, so to say, what is inside. Okay? So if you are sending, 10 animals, so on the top of that clay envelope, you basically create a circle. So because this is, in wet clay, you can make imprints, right? So you create a circle like this. If you're sending 100 animals, so in addition to the token you send inside that clay envelope, on top of the envelope, you mark it with these 2 notches and so on. And then another brainwave. All right, if you're already sending it in this envelope, why do you actually need to send the actual tokens? You can just send the envelope itself without any tokens inside it. And at that point, you had these kinds of tablets. So this is one of the earliest of these accounting tablets, which is basically just a tabulation of all the donations that are being sent. Okay. So this is Shimon Pecheret's idea of how actually originally writing arose. It arose essentially to replace a system of communicating how many of certain types of votive offerings are being sent from one place to another. And this accounting tokens are what essentially evolved into writing. And this is something that has been remarked at by others, that what we actually recognize as writing today has a lot of syntax. But syntax is almost non-existent in early Sumerian writing. And in fact, there's no evidence of grammar until about a few centuries after the invention of proto-cuneiform. So if you see look at this administrative clay tablets, they're just a sequence, without any order of, several numbers. And as I already mentioned, even today, grammar has little or no role to play in ledgers. So there has been, suggestions that maybe the Indus inscriptions just refer to numbers. They are purely invoices or inventories. So this is, Shimon Pecheret's illustration of how actually Sumerian writing arose. So around the period of 8500 BC, we have evidence that there were simply plain tokens. And then the tokens are getting more and more complex. And around the same period, you have this, round clay envelopes inside which these tokens are placed, and then the whole thing is baked, so that to see this, you have to actually break it. But then to indicate what is inside, you are making markings. So, like for example, if you take a look at this clay envelope, you can clearly see these notches which are made, which essentially say what is inside. And at some point, people suddenly realize, hold on a second, folks, you don't require to put any tokens inside, so you can just, put this flat clay tablets, and then you start making notches to indicate certain numbers. And then after a while, you have this, around 3000 BC, finally people start making notches which represent more than just numbers. Okay. And people have argued that given that Indus Valley had a close trade connections with the people of Mesopotamia, it probably will be not very surprising if the idea of writing diffused through these trade contacts to the Indus Valley. So that's why people have suggested that, it won't be surprising if this idea is what underlies many of these Indus inscriptions. And in fact, the most of the Indus inscriptions, as Ashraf will point out today during his talk, are actually quite short. So it's possible that these are not really writing in the full sense of the term, but they are only meant in a very, very specialized context. Maybe it's just indicating who is sending it, or identifying the sender, identifying the receiver. And the economic nature of this inscription is kind of verified by the fact that in many cases, the sealing that you see has the seal on one side. On the other side, you can clearly see that it was affixed to some kind of a fabric, maybe a piece of rope, or maybe some piece of cloth, which was used to basically tie the mouth of a jar. So these were like using sealing to seal off a particular container, and then on top of that, you mark who is sending it with a particular seal. In the very way that, for example, you might send a piece of official document from one place to another. So you will give wax and you put a seal on top of that to indicate that if the seal is broken, then obviously your communication has been compromised. All right. Another hypothesis that has been suggested is that it's not really communicating spoken language, but is just meant to identify the clan or identity of the bearer. And there is some suggestion that seals were used in Mesopotamia during the Uruk period in this way. Okay, so this is, of course, taken from the medieval period. So this is Edward III's heraldic device. This is Richard II's heraldic device. But we know that even nomadic tribes of Central Asia have tended to use this. So, for example, these are the heraldic devices used by Turkic tribes. So they are called tagmas. And this in particular has been suggested by Michael Witzel that the Indus might be the Indus signs might be actually similar to these kinds of tagmas, but you can actually test this by looking at whether so if there were truly heraldic elements, then very complex sign combinations would be very less likely to appear. And so if you have a recursive structure, it's very likely that they are not simply heraldic devices or tagmas, which one can actually test. Okay, then another hypothesis is, there's something wrong with this thing. Yeah, another hypothesis which I mentioned in yesterday's lecture is that this could be a symbol similar to the one that Dabbawalas use. So for example, here I mentioned VLP stands for Residential Station Villeparle, and then this 9 is the code for Dabbawalas, that's the destination. EX stands for Express Towers. 12 is the floor number of the building, and so on. And there is so Kurush Dalal was the archaeologist who first suggested that it could be something, Indus could be something similar. And the fact that some of the sealings were attached to the fabric which sealed off certain containers suggests that it may not be a very far-fetched idea. And in fact, there are Mesopotamian seals which were used to mark sender and receiver. Again, you can try to test this by looking at do signs occur at certain positions very commonly, and are there more variations in other positions? Is there correlation of sign occurrence with the location in which those signs have been found, and so on? The fourth suggestion has been forwarded by, for example, Farmer in that infamous paper of Farmer, Sproat, and Witzel, where he said that Indus symbols are non-linguistic in character, and they serve religious, political, or social functions without encoding speech. Now, this is an example of such symbols being used for purely religious token purposes. So this is the Assyrian stele showing one of the kings of Assyria, Assur-Nasir-Pal. And what you notice is that there is writing here. The writing you can see, so there is this cuneiform kind of writing located at the back, but there's also these symbols. So 5 symbols which are indicated over here, which represent the various gods. And the reason why Farmer proposed this was that, look, you have a small number of very high frequency signs, length of inscriptions are relatively short, and so on. And so maybe there is not really any meaning per se associated with the particular sequence. Rather, each symbol might have a meaning, and they are kind of can be given in some kind of a free order. The argument against this, which was proposed by Brian Wells, is that, well, many seals of various cultures actually typically have short inscriptions. So these are the Indus texts, but these are the texts from Uruk in Sumerian cuneiform. This is Proto-Elamite from Iran. This is Chinese seal. So these are Egyptian seals, all of which have just as short inscriptions as Indus. So by itself, being short does not argue that they don't have any syntax, any meaning per se. The fifth hypothesis is that they could be probably just being used to memorize some things. You want to remember something, and you just create a system by which you basically figure out, how do you, that this knot indicates that I have to remember, A. This knot indicates that I have to remember B, and so on. And it used to be thought that one of the, most wonderful examples of mnemonic devices is this quipu, or a system of knotted chords that used to be used by the Inca in South America to, basically make records of tax obtained, population censuses, and so on. So this quipus can actually be quite complex in character. Okay? And given that the Incas used to rule an extremely large empire, it's actually the largest pre-Columbian empire, it's kind of surprising that they didn't have any writing system per se, but used quipus to exchange information such as census data, tribute accounts, storehouse inventories across large distances. And so people used to suspect that there is more to quipu than meets the eye. And then in the 1920s, the anthropologist Leland Locke analyzed the quipus which are stored in the American Museum of Natural History. And he showed that you can actually think of them as something like an abacus. So he said that, look, each quipu has a primary chord. So here you will have a primary chord on which each of these pendant chords are attached. And the knots are actually made on these pendant chords. And so his idea was that what is happening is that each of these pendant chords would have certain number of knots. And these knots actually represent numbers. So if you have a single knot, it's like number 1, 2 knots, number 2, and so on, up to 9 knots. And then depending upon the position of these knots, you can actually have a position value system. So this could be units, tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000, and so on. So if there are 2 knots over here, 4 knots over here, 9 knots over here, 1 over here, and 8 over here, then you can read it as 24,918. So this is in some sense a positional writing system, positional notation numbering system, quite sophisticated. And this would, of course, fit with what we already know about the Incan numbering system, that they had a decimal system. So, so for a long time, it was thought that, okay, this is probably all that the quipus used to do. But interestingly, there's a very intriguing reference from the Spanish poet who used to be in the court of the Spanish governorate in Peru, Garcilaso de la Vega. So his account actually clearly mentions that Incas recorded in our knots everything that could be counted, even mentioning battles and fights, all the embassies that had come to visit the Inca, and all the speeches and arguments they had uttered. Hold on, folks. How are they recording speeches and arguments? They are not numbers. Okay? So he mentions where, instance where this priest comes into the court, takes a quipu, and sings a very complex song just by going through each of the pendant chords of this quipu, in a way that clearly indicates that he was actually reading the quipu and not just memorizing things, not just recalling things by looking at each chord. And this kind of hinted that the quipu was more than just an accounting system. It was in some sense recording speech. But people had no clue how this could happen. Very recently, 2 anthropologists, Gary Urton, who is at Harvard, and Sabine Hyland, who is in the University of St. Andrews, have come up with parallel evidence that the quipu could be actually encoding writing. So Urton basically found that the quipu is more than just knots. If you look at the color of the strings, the way the knots are structured, the directions in which you are hitching these knots, then each of these could encode information. So if you tie a knot in one direction, it could mean paid, in the other it could mean unpaid, and so on. And in 2018, along with an undergraduate, Medrano, he demonstrated that a particular quipu which came from a village for which we also have a Spanish census document from the same era, namely the 1670s, had exactly 132 chords, and he knew from the Spanish census documents that there were 132 families which paid tribute. So now you have 132 chords going like this. Each chord represents a particular family. And so then what they tried to do was that they started looking at this census document to find whether they could find patterns, numerical patterns, which they could have correspondences with the notes that are given in each of these pendant chords. And they eventually found that you could actually, by looking at how the pendant chords are tied to the primary chord, indicate the clan to which each of these tribute pairs are belonging. Sabine Highland looked at another village, San Juan de Colata, where there were several pendant chords, several of these quipus which had been preserved in the local church. And she found that by looking at the type of color, which animal's fiber has been used to make the rope, so you can guess the texture by actually handling the rope. So by looking at the fiber that is used and the direction in which the ply or the fiber goes, you can actually have 95 different combinations. And so she speculated that could this actually indicate that it's a writing system with 95 distinct symbols. And since this comes to the order of number of symbols which typically represent a syllabic system, could this be a syllabic system? Of course, I mean, this still remains in the realm of hypothesis, but these are some kind of a new direction. So this is like all of this is dating from about 2018 or so. New directions in which people are taking, that writing could be so distinct. So writing need not be just, marks indicated on a piece of paper, on a piece of papyrus, or a piece of stone. Writing could be as different as basically just notes made on strings. Okay, so when we are encountering ancient inscription, how do we decipher? So there are several problems. Well, for Indus, for example, there are no multilingual texts. The language is unknown. The type of writing system is unknown. And so we have to depend on, figuring out how many signs are there, what is the direction of writing, is there a set of signs which are being used more often than others, and what is the grammar. Now, each of these have, interesting aspects to it. So, for example, if you have a bilingual or a trilingual inscription where the same text is written in different scripts, at least one of which has known. So for example, Rosetta Stone is a very famous piece of stone which was discovered in 1799 by Napoleon's expedition to Egypt. And since it was at the town of Rashid they found it, they named it after the town as the Rosetta Stone. Now it's very famous because it has the same text written in 3 different scripts. So on the top, there is Egyptian hieroglyphics. In the middle, there is Demotic, which is another form of writing Egyptian. And both of these scripts at that time were not readable. They were undeciphered. But at the bottom of the stone, you have the same piece of text written in ancient Greek, which of course was known. And so it finally gave hope to people that by using this, you can actually decipher Demotic and hieroglyphics. Now, you might think, okay, that's pretty easy, right? I have something which is written in unknown piece of text and something which is written in a known piece of text, so I can just, look at the correspondence and figure it out what is written. It's not so easy. So it took eventually 2 decades to figure out hieroglyphics. And the major contributions to deciphering hieroglyphics came from 2 people, the Britisher Thomas Young, who's actually very famous for his contributions to physics. If you come or if you have done some physics at +2 stage, you know about the Young slits experiment, which is used to show the wave nature of light. Then you also have Young's modulus when you are measuring elasticity and so on. He was actually a doctor by training, but he's more famous for his contributions to physics. And he also actually provided one of the key hints as to how to read the hieroglyphics. But of course, the person who is most famously associated with decipherment of hieroglyphics is the French savant, Champollion. And both of these people actually owe a debt to Sylvestre de Sacy, who in 1811 said that, look, the foreign names or non-Egyptian names will be spelt out phonetically using hieroglyphic symbols because there are no corresponding hieroglyphic symbols for those. Okay? So, this relates to the question that Rahul was asking early on. That if you are using Chinese to write a foreign name, like Rahul, for example, there is no Chinese character standing for Rahul. So how would you write it? Okay. So you have to use some principle by which you can write names which are not native to that particular writing system. Right? So one way is to use the rebus principle. Okay? So Thomas Young suggested that this particular Rosetta Stone was actually inscribed at the time when the king of Egypt was of the Ptolemaic dynasty. So the Ptolemies were, of course, Greek. Okay, so when Alexander had taken over Egypt, following his death, his general Ptolemy took over Egypt, and subsequently his successors, who were all called Ptolemies, Ptolemy I, Ptolemy II, and so on, they were the pharaohs of Egypt. And since the Rosetta Stone dates from one of these Ptolemies, it was clear that the royal cartouche, which indicated the name of the king, which could of course be read from the Greek part of the text as Ptolemaios, had to be written in some form of hieroglyphics, but hieroglyphics being used in a phonetic way. So this was a key idea, that somehow you can use hieroglyphic symbols not to indicate just an idea, but also to indicate a particular sound value. And so what Champollion did was, he said that, oh, look, okay, so there are two royal names shown in the cartouche. So one is the name of Ptolemaios, the other is the name of the queen Cleopatra. Now, this is Ptolemys, so you can see that this E is absent. This is Cleopatra. So suppose I say this is P, okay, so this is the P of Ptolemaios. And then for Cleopatra, there should also be a P. So I see whether there is a square occurring in this name. Yes, there is. So this square must be representing P. Then in Ptolemaios, there will be a O, and he kind of guessed that this particular knotted rope must stand for an O. Now Cleopatra will also have a O. So let's see whether the O, whether this knotted rope symbol occurs here. Yes, it occurs over here. And then Ptolemaios would have L, and again he says that, okay, maybe it's the lion, and Cleopatra would also have an L, so maybe it's the lion. So okay, so then it's the lion, which stands for L. So in this way, he figured out that you can use actually the Egyptian hieroglyphics phonetically. So there could be some kind of a correspondence between sound values and particular hieroglyphic symbols. And in fact, then he went on to show that even Egyptian names, which are, which you expect that, would have a single hieroglyphic sign to represent them, even Egyptian names can be written phonetically using hieroglyphic symbols. For example, Ramesses, the famous pharaoh, his name would be written in phonetically as Ra, Ma, Sa, Sa, okay? Where this stands for the sun god Ra. So this is a stylistic representation of the sun, and Ra is the god of sun, and so that's why Ra is represented by this circle inscribed within a circle. This is Ma, and then these two hook-like signs to stand for S. Yeah, also, these are hieroglyphic symbols from two very, very different eras, and the Ma could actually have a different, yeah. So it could be that the particular accent on Ma is different. Yeah, possible. Now, this actually gives a wonderful, point of departure to alphabetic writing, because this means that underlying the hieroglyphic system, there is a backbone of a phonetic system which one can use to write alphabetically. And in fact, yeah.
They pronounce it differently.
Sorry?
They write it differently and pronounce it differently. Like, not as in say English and Chinese. They have the same thing, but they write it differently and they have a separate, like, pronounce it differently as well. So,
I mean for ma. This is in the context of Rahul's question.
yeah, kind of.
Yeah, so, frankly, I don't know the answer to this. This is, one of the things that is often shown, how he did it, but it could be that the ma is actually pronounced differently in Ramesses and Ptolemaios, but,
No, as in like it sounds say in English,
Yeah.
say same, say Ramesses.
yeah.
And if you want to write it in say Chinese, they'll write it in some way, and they might not say it says Ramesses and like something different. Yeah, yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, it's possible. So the fact that there could be a phonetic backbone of underlying Egyptian is very, very interesting, because it is believed currently that the origin of alphabet actually occurred in the Sinai desert. So this is this Proto-Sinaitic, Proto-alphabetic system. So this is dated from somewhere between mid-19th century and 16th century BCE. And you have basically this, short inscriptions where effectively simplified Egyptian hieroglyphic signs are used, but they're used using the rebus principle. So what is the rebus principle? So suppose you want to write belief, okay, but you only have a pictographic writing system. So the way you will write is you will draw a picture of a bee and you'll draw a picture of a leaf. And so here, when you combine these two, it's not supposed to represent a bee, sitting on a leaf, but rather you're using these pictures for their sound values. So when you combine them, you would have the word belief, which has nothing to do, of course, with a bee or a leaf. Okay? So this is the rebus principle. And it is believed that here, so the people who wrote this were not Egyptians themselves. So they were the Jewish workers working on, the temples of that were being built in the Sinai at that time. And they were, of course, familiar with their overlords, the Egyptians, using hieroglyphics. But hieroglyphics being an extremely complex writing system, it was hard for them to actually learn it and use it for their own purposes. So instead, they used it in a very different way. So what they used was, they used the hieroglyphic symbol for a word which starts with M, and so they use it to represent ma. They used the hieroglyphic symbol for a word which begins with a L, and they used it to represent la. They take the ox's head, which stands for, the word of ox starts with a ba in Egyptian, so they use it to indicate ba and so on. And doing this, they write this mat la bal, which stands for to the lady in Proto-Hebrew. And so, starting from this Proto-Sinaitic, you have the Northern Semitic and Southern Semitic developing, which from the Northern Semitic you have early Hebrew, Phoenician, and so on, and from Phoenician you have the Greek, and eventually, the various European, the Latin alphabetic system and so on. From the other branch, you have Aramaic, which went on to make modern Hebrew, and also, Nabatean, Uyghur, and so on. And from Southern Semitic, you have the Ethiopian. Now, this is very, very contentious. So, unlike writing, which is believed to have originated multiple times in history, alphabetic writing system is believed to have occurred only once. All alphabetic writing system essentially derives from the Proto-Sinaitic, it is believed. Now, the problem is Brahmi. Okay, so it is widely believed that Brahmi is not an independent writing system, not an independently discovered alphabetic writing system, because there were obviously many other alphabetic writing systems which were contemporaneous. However, one cannot easily relate the characters of Brahmi as just modified versions of some existing alphabetic writing systems, such as coexisting alphabetic writing systems of that time. Unlike Kharoshthi, Kharoshthi was very much at use in northwest India, and you can directly relate Kharoshthi to the existing Semitic writing systems. Brahmi is a big question mark. And Brahmi, of course, gave rise to all the modern Indian writing that we use today. So one of the big questions is, where did Brahmi come from? And I think Nandini is going to talk very briefly about that a bit. Let me just point out that one of the recent hypotheses that have been put forward as to how to explain this anomalous nature of Brahmi is by looking at a relatively recent writing system, Hangul, which is used for writing Korean. So Korean alphabet actually dates from only about the 14th century, when King Sejong actually asked his group of learned scholars to invent a writing system which was much more easy for common people to learn than the traditional Chinese characters that was very, very hard to learn. So only elite specialists could actually learn Chinese. So this group of scholars looked at many different writing systems, and then they invented a specific writing system which used 14 consonants and 10 vowels, so that it has an alphabet of 24 letters. But interestingly, the letters themselves that you see in a Korean text are not just pure consonants or pure vowels. They're actually combinations of syllabic blocks which are made out of multiple consonants and vowels. So for example, if you look at this one, this is actually made out of 2 consonants and 1 vowel. This is made out of consonant, vowel, consonant. This is made out of 1 consonant and 1 vowel. This is made out of, again, 1 consonant and 1 vowel. So each of these letters, so to say, that you see is actually a syllabic block which is made out of 2 to 3 consonants and vowels. And so it's possible that Brahmi was also such an invented writing system. So this is a hypothesis that has been proposed by a few epigraphists, which was designed by a group of scholars, essentially at the time of Ashoka, for administrative purposes. Anyway, so just to end my talk, so just as Egypt had its own Rosetta Stone, for Sumerian cuneiform also we were lucky to get a corresponding trilingual at Behistun, which was written using 3 scripts, Babylonian, Elamite, and Old Persian. And Grotefend in 1802 deciphered the most recent of these writings, Old Persian, and then Elamite and Babylonian were subsequently deciphered by Rawlinson and co-workers. But of course, you have successful decipherment even without bilingual text. The most famous example being Linear B. So this is a syllabic writing system that was used for writing Mycenaean Greek around the 15th century BCE. And if you look at examples of this, there are about 200 signs. Okay, so now we know that actually these are 87 syllabic signs, and there are a few of the remaining are actually ideograms which have some semantic character. Now the first step towards deciphering Linear B was taken by Alice Cober, who pointed out that many of these sequences actually have either a common prefix or a common suffix. And she kind of guessed that these might be consonant-vowel combinations. So what is happening is that you have certain consonants which are being used in conjunction with certain vowels. So this commonality was essentially representing some kind of a consonant-vowel structure. So this idea was then taken by Michael Ventris, an architect by training, to actually construct this kind of a syllabic grid where he worked out each of the syllables as being some combinations of consonant and vowels. So you can see an example of his syllabic grid where he figured out how the each of these syllables were being represented using some consonant vowel combination, and eventually deciphered by connecting it with Greek place names. He actually deciphered Linear B. And there was, of course, a huge controversy when he published this, because many people claimed this isn't writing. Okay? But of course, what is implicit in this criticism is it's not writing as we know it. But there is no particular reason why the Mycenaeans wouldn't use writing in that particular way. And it is, of course, very hard to use this writing for writing arbitrary text, but it was primarily used for recording accounts, inventories, So it's not really a continuous prose. It's not like, songs about heroes and so on. So for that particular specific purpose, the way in which this was written was perfectly adequate. And last but not the least, just wanted to mention that another wonderful example of decipherment which did not use bilingual is the decipherment of Mayan hieroglyphs. So Mayan hieroglyphs for a long time was not deciphered, primarily because people didn't suspect that these glyphs could actually represent writing. So the refusal by archaeologists to believe that these glyphs were not just pure decorative element and could represent writing actually proved the biggest stumbling block, until eventually the Russian Yuri Norosov figured out, using the records of Landa, who was a Jesuit missionary sent to convert the Mayans to Christianity, but who recorded a certain correspondence between the signs used by the Mayans and the corresponding sound value. He used this particular record of Dalanda to eventually decipher the Mayan. But for a successful decipherment, almost inevitably you either require to guess correctly the underlying language, and this is the case for Linear B and Mayan. So in the case of Linear B, Ventris actually correctly guessed that it is Greek of some form. And for the case of Mayan hieroglyphics, Mayan was still a living language, and so Norosov could actually use knowledge of Mayan to actually figure it out. Or you have to use the writing system, you have to know the writing system which has been used for writing some known language. And this is the case for, let's say, the trilingual, or like the Rosetta Stone or the Bay Stone inscription. Without either of these lucky breaks, it seems kind of quite hard to decipher unknown writing, and this has been the main stumbling block for Indus. So I think I've set up the stage now for the talk after lunch, in which Ashraf is going to give you a background of the Indus civilization, because that is one of our key focus areas in this center, where we are trying to figure out how to actually eventually crack this particular writing system. So thank you for attention. And
we assume that languages in proximity will share some roots or something. Is there any known, sibling of contemporary Harappan civilization which has survived? Can one at least have some tracing of the language itself? Like people trace languages, how they have evolved, like dendrogram of languages.
So do you mean language or do you mean writing system?
Language.
Language. Okay, so Ashraf would actually talk about this. So there's a big debate as to what could have been the language of the Indus civilization. Okay, there are several candidates. Ashraf will talk about this in detail. So it could be Proto-Dravidian. It could be, and this is of course favored by certain
groups,
factions, that it is actually Proto-Sanskrit, although there is not that much evidence in favor of that. Some have claimed that it is Proto-Munda, but latest evidence shows that Proto-Munda actually arrived in the Orissa coast only about 1900 BCE. So that would be towards the declining stage of Indus Valley. So unlikely it's Proto-Munda.
And for these proto-languages, is some sort of like their remnants known?
So actually interesting that you mentioned this. So you can actually figure out the Proto-X by looking at the current languages that derive from it.
Yes.
So people have reconstructed Proto-Indo-European by
Yes.
looking at all the modern languages that are there today. So you use a technique very familiar to biologists, which is basically you assume that there is a certain way in which mutations occur. Okay? And different modern the daughter languages would have different mutations occurring in them, and that mutations accumulate in a particular way. So there's just as you have a mutation clock in biology, where you can actually figure out when two branches diverged by looking at how many mutations had accumulated, assuming a constant rate of mutations. Here also you can actually assume a similar rate at which mutations occur, and by looking at all the different variants, you can try to work out what could have been the original way in which, let's say, the root word for father, or root word for mother, or root word for son was in Proto-Indo-European. So because, there are about, there was this linguist called Swadesh, who actually made a list of, let's say, order of 200 words, which he said every language must have. Words like son, father, mother, water, and so on. And he focused on these words in different Indo-European languages and see how close they are, and from there try to reconstruct what they must have sounded like in Proto-Indo-European. So this is how actually people go. They look at daughter languages still survive today, and then from these various different mutants, try to figure out what the original might have looked like.
So will it be a, like, at least if not feasible, a plausible approach that one takes like these three possible routes that you mentioned and tries to fit Indus Valley like writings to as like, and again there are multiple forms of writing, alpha syllabaries, logograms, ideograms, and whatever, and you try to fit them to this like spoken, like constructed spoken languages of that period?
Well, I mean, to some extent, this is the approach that, let's say, Mahadevan and Parpola have done. They have assumed it to be Dravidian, Proto-Dravidian, and they have taken, Dravidian roots like mean for this fish sign, which also stands for star, and tried to reconstruct what it might have, what certain inscription might have sounded like. But, these are highly debated.
Yes.
So you need, other ways of corroborating these readings.
So you can say all these things, but unless you decipher, no writing system can be proved that is writing system, or opposite the same thing.
So his Ronnie's point is, can you actually try out all the different hypotheses and generate various readings, and then try to see which are the most consistent ones?
Yeah, but again, all hypotheses can be debated, right?
No, all of them can be debated. His point is like, which is the most consistent one, if I have understood him correctly. Okay. No, I mean, in principle, that's a wonderful way, and I think in some sense, computational approaches actually would allow us to do precisely that, because this is very hard to do manually, but using computational tools, probably you can actually try to do this. Okay. That's right. It's a logo-Silvic script. Sorry?
We can read with alphabets I or A, B, C or something.
No, so like for a long time it used to be a problem that people used to think that Lambda just made this up. So there's this famous Lambda alphabet. So Lambda was, as I said, a Jesuit missionary who was working with the Mayans to convert them. And he kind of wrote down this correspondence, what he called the Mayan alphabet. But anyone who later on came and in contact with the Mayans knew it's completely nonsense to say that they were using an alphabetic writing system. So for a long time, people thought that Lambda just made this up, or maybe his interpreters misled him. Until Norosov realized that what happened was this. Lambda, who had no other conception of writing system other than an alphabet, would point at a particular or would say that, what is your A? Okay? And of course, the Mayan interpreter would give him a word which starts with A. All right? So essentially, this stands for a word which begins with an A. It's not yet an alphabet, okay? But essentially, it's the beginning. It's a word which begins with that particular sound value, and that's the misunderstanding between Lambda and his interpreter. Okay? So Lambda was correct partially, that there is in fact a sound correspondence between these symbols and the phonetic values, but it is not alphabet in any sense of the word. Okay? So these are actually, meant, these could be written, so they have a logographic element, they also have a syllabic component, okay? So a name could be written purely logographically, if that name has a corresponding logogram, or it could be also written syllabically, okay, by just using syllabic components in Mayan. Sorry, Rahul, you had a... Oh, that's because of the Spanish. No, the Spanish. The Spanish missionaries burnt all their manuscripts and forbade them from using their own writing because they said it was devil worship. It was a cultural genocide, actually. Yeah.
Short inscriptions. So in that sense, Indus script cannot be just regarded as like they only have economic purposes, and probably they have more. Probably it was more than just economic connotations, right? But what I was thinking is the entire civilization reached its zenith, then had a fall, and through this entire time, we till now we haven't gotten yet a long inscription. So all we have are short inscriptions from Indus. So then does that probably suggest that they were eventually, after all, just used as economic purposes and nothing more than that?
That is certainly one of the hypotheses that have been put forward. So there would be people who countered this by saying that maybe long inscriptions were there, but they have either A, not been recovered, B, they were written in perishable materials. So for example, and this is a point that Rajesh Rao beautifully makes in one of his YouTube lectures. He said that suppose, the civilization that we have today, something cataclysm happens, and let's say centuries later, someone comes and is digging through our cultural artifacts. So we will have things like, this, and these are typically very short inscriptions, or this short inscription.
And we won't have a long inscription.
Coke cans, short inscription, because all the books will be lost, and of course all our electronic records would be the first to go. Okay,
Right.
so we'll be only left with short inscriptions.
We'll be a very backward civilization in that sense. No accounting whatsoever.
So you could argue either way. You could.
Also, I wanted to point out one thing in one of your slides.
Yeah.
So there was a tree diagram for all the derivatives of Brahmi.
Yeah.
And one of those pointed to Pali, but Pali is a language and not a script.
Yeah, so that is something that I just borrowed from the net. Sorry, I mean, there could be mistakes there. I didn't check it very thoroughly. I bow to your, superior knowledge, of course. I mean, I'm not a linguist, let me point out this way. So it's quite possible it's mistaken. I just meant to show to you that all alphabetic writing is assumed to flow from this Proto-Sinaitic. Brahmi is the only one where there is a question mark. And Brahmi is important for us because all the modern Indian writing systems derives from it. So this is something also that we have recently become very interested in. Nandini is spearheading that effort of trying to figure out, can we say something significantly about Brahmi? Like, what could have led to its invention or evolution and so on.
Are all the different forms of alphabets Ziphian?
Sorry?
Are all the different forms of alphabets Ziphian? Like, do they follow the Zips?
Oh, Ziphian. Okay. I think Ashraf would have more to say about Ziph. So the thing is that Ziph's law, as it is mentioned, applies strictly only to word frequency,
Okay.
not to letter frequency, right? But what Ashraf has shown is that if you take a slightly different generalized point of view, you can actually apply Ziph even to ideographic systems, alphabetic systems, and logosyllabic systems.
So how does one, like, since we have no starting point, how does one understand that this is like logosyllabic or alphasyllabic? Like, do they have characteristic?
one quick way is just to count the number of distinct signs you have. As I said, alphabet would typically have order of 30, pure alphabet. Okay, something like in alpha syllabary system like we use in our
No,
Indian
but
writing
that
systems.
sort of borrows on like our current system. It may not have been necessary that they have the same number of letters or a
No,
single
in
letter?
and around the same number of letters. I'm saying order of.
Okay.
So order of 30 is what a pure alphabet uses. There will be lots of variation even within existing alphabets. Okay. But as I said, if you are using an alpha syllabary, which loosely is also called an alphabet, so we call our writing system an
Bengali.
alphabet, right? But it's actually not a pure alphabet, it's an alpha syllabary. An alpha syllabary, you have to consider ka
The combinations.
and ka to be actually distinct symbols. Okay?
Yes.
So then you are using a few hundred, right? Syllabic writing system would typically involve about 100 symbols. And then logosyllabic would use of the order of a few thousand, and ideographic would use a order of a few tens of thousands. So just like the simplest starting point is just to look at how many distinct signs are there.
And like, we can discuss
Yeah,
this
yeah.
later.
Because I think we are really, really getting late for lunch, and Ashraf's talk will get delayed otherwise. So I know it's already 1:25, but please try to get here by. Sorry. Let's make it 2 and. Okay. All right. So please be back here at 2 so that.